Just a little bit of background on me. Again, my name is Vidhika, and yeah, I'm a UX manager, and I work very closely with a lot of different functions. But one of the things that I see as a very common, ask is just this idea of like we have to move fast, and it's a mantra that we're all used to, right? That when moving too fast really isn't supposed to break things. The idea, I think the intentions are always good. It's the intention is let's not obsess about perfection. Let's make sure we're just keeping some momentum. So it's really great in theory, but what I've noticed is that it's a little bit outdated because sometimes when we move too fast, we really can break things, and not just break things, but we can hurt people. So my argument here is that I think we don't always have to do that. I think we don't always have to break something. Sometimes we can just predict what might go wrong and try to stop it from happening in the first place. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about just some examples of how when not thinking ahead has broken things, and how we can use our power and our privilege to proactively prevent that in what we build. So why does this matter? Well, I want to share a little comic with you first of all. And as you can tell in here, moving too fast isn't always the right approach. It's not always the best one, and it doesn't work in all contexts. Not everything can break and just kind of still be okay, right? So, an example on this list is just a surgeon, right? You wouldn't want your surgeon to be doing like an MVP surgery. Now, if let's say your surgeon decided like, oh, I'm just gonna move fast, don't worry, you would be very concerned because you hired your surgeon for the opposite reason, is that you want them to heal something. You want to make sure that they're doing their due diligence. Your loved ones would feel the same way. So obviously that's a little bit of an extreme example, and you might be thinking, well, tech is different, right? Because we're not surgeons. We don't have people's lives in our hands, quite literally. And while that's true, I think that a lot of the jobs that even let's say a surgeon is doing, right? That often requires on technology that some of us are going to be helping build. And at the end of the day, some things just aren't worth breaking. It's just plain and simple. Moving too fast can hurt individuals. It can hurt businesses, and it can even just hurt society as a whole. There's a lot of ripple effects involved. So we're going to talk a little bit about some specifics. Before I go any further, I just want to make a couple of notes. One is that intention is not equal to impact. I very much know that we never mean to make things that are bad, right? Most of us, I think, many of us got into this field because we want to build things that help people. So, but just because something isn't built to have harm doesn't mean it can't still have harm. There can still be unintended consequences. So it's just something that we need to be really mindful of, separating our intentions from the potential impact that we might have. Secondly, foresight is better than hindsight. We don't want to just be reactive. We want to be proactive when we're trying to prevent bad consequences. Obviously, we can't figure out everything in advance. There's some things that we're just going to have to learn the hard way, but there are some things that we can just get ahead of if we give our work a little bit of thought, deliberation, try to account for things that aren't just the happy path. And finally, inaction is essentially like being complicit, right? If we're not part of the solution, we're sort of part of the problem. We are really lucky in the sense that we get to be privy to things that are early stage. We get to build a lot of the tools that the world runs on. And we have a voice and a seat at the table that many others don't. So it's really important that we lose our privilege for good. I have a little asterisk here because this is a nuanced and complex topic, and it could be a whole different talk. But I understand that there's times where we can't speak up. There's times that we don't have the leeway to say something that maybe we think deserves more time or should be done a different way because we have a non-negotiable deadline, or a boss telling us this, we don't have a choice and we don't want to lose our jobs. And so I'm not suggesting that we put ourselves in bad situations. I think it's like the saying goes, right? Like you want to put your mask on first before helping someone else. And I'm realizing that that's an expression that used to refer to airplanes, and nowadays people think of COVID, but you get the gist. Essentially, you want to make sure that you're taking care of yourself first. But a lot of times, even the tiniest actions that we take, even if it's just on our own little piece of the pie, the work that we are directly responsible for, we can have a really big impact. So just don't doubt your power. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this, it's that. All right, so there are a lot of different things that can go wrong when we anytime we build something, things are used differently. There's things that we couldn't have guessed would happen. But a couple of categories that come to mind. One is abuse, right? There's sometimes bad actors who are problematic and they're simply using what we build. They're finding vulnerabilities to take advantage of other people for their own benefit. Then there's the situations that are just everyday life. A lot of times, something that's just someone's just using something as they intend. They don't even realize that something could go wrong, and some small mistake happens, and it may be because the usability of the product was bad, or something just wasn't accounted for, or different people are different, right? There's lots of use cases, and we don't always account for all of them. And then finally, life happens. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that not everything follows a neat path. Life doesn't always go according to plan, and there's a lot of painful realities that we need to account for and proactively in our products. All right, so I'm going to deep dive a little bit on each of these, give you a couple of examples so you know what I mean. For the first one, abuse, it's when bad actors show up. And for this one, I'm going to talk about Zoom a good bit in this presentation because I think it's something that all of us have probably spent a lot of time in. And if someone wanted to wreak havoc on Zoom earlier in the pandemic, it wasn't very hard because uh, the default setting was such that any meeting participant could share their screen without any host permission. Anyone with a public link could just join a meeting. And so there were a lot of instances of Zoom bombing. I don't know if any of you experienced this, but I know that at the very beginning of the pandemic, once we were stay-at-home orders were issued, I was obviously just I was bummed about it, but I was also like, wow, I can now attend all of these conferences and talks and all of this content from all around the world that had now gone virtual that previously I wouldn't have had access to. And so I was attending all of these things. And one of these like talks that I attended, it was like a meetup talk. I went to it and it was my first experience with Zoom bombing. And it was very confusing because a couple of minutes in, a couple of teenagers just kind of took control of our Zoom meeting, and this event that I was super excited for not only just got canceled, like never, they just shut it down because they couldn't figure out how to turn it off, but it was also incredibly uncomfortable because there were, these kids they were saying like slurs. There was some inappropriate content shared. It was just a mess. And so that's in some ways still minor. My experience was just, it was bothersome. My event got canceled. Um, it was jarring. But there's situations where that Zoom bombing had resulted in like a lot of racist comments and misogynistic comments and anti-Semitism. There's all sorts of things that people were subjected to against their will and unexpectedly. So this is a good example of where it was just a bad default setting. Now that they've changed the settings so that not just anyone can share their screen without permission, those kinds of instances are a lot less likely to happen. And so even though I'm talking about, slowing us down and not always moving so fast, sometimes it's just a matter of taking a minute or an hour to think about what are some ways that this could be a little different. Another example is some years ago, Facebook Messenger used to have a feature where if your GPS was turned on and you were chatting with someone, that person could just tap on a message that you sent and they could see your exact like location. Now, I used to use Facebook Messenger a ton back in 2015 and I didn't even know that. So that kind of scares me looking back. I don't know who all I've probably shared my location with, but it wasn't something that you enabled on purpose. It was something that I like to kind of call an aggressive default. It's a setting that people unwittingly are just subject to and they didn't even realize they could change. But as you can see in this tweet, it's kind of scary because it can lead to a lot of abuse. And here's an example of some actual abuse that occurred because of this oversight, which again, I want to make clear that this feature was probably intended for convenience, right? It wasn't intended for anything bad. It was intended so that you probably have an easy time like figuring out where each other are if you're talking to your best friend or something like that. But again, it could pave the way for stalking, invasion of privacy. We're often blinded, I think, by our good intentions. And this example where this person's talking about how her ex showed up at her boyfriend, started throwing beer bottles on her car, it made her stalking worse. That's pretty terrifying. And obviously there was some damage there. There was property damage for sure. There was probably some psychological damage, but they also has implications for like physical harm down the road if the stalking were to have continued. So it's just a reminder that it doesn't take a lot for a bad actor to take advantage of a situation that doesn't have some fail safes in place. Now, the next category is just everyday use. There's so many use cases. So bad actors aren't the only ones that cause harm. Lots of times, harm can occur in just everyday situations, just because people use things differently. People are different, and if that's not accounted for, we're going to have bad consequences. So last year, there was a report of like a glitch in Zoom that caused parts of people's screens to show even when they weren't sharing. So like right now, I'm sharing a screen with you, and it's if thanks to this glitch, it could have been possible that you might have been able to see my if I had like my texts open or something like that, you might have been able to see all of that, which might seem really minor. Like maybe you're in a work meeting and accidentally people could have seen the guilty pleasure show you were watching on Netflix or something. But it could also be really serious. You could have had health records open. You could have a conversation that was really heavy with a family member or something like that. And I know that there's this ideally you could say, well, if you want to prevent security issues, just keep personal things on your personal computer and professional things on your professional computer or whatever, your work computer. But nowadays, especially as the last few talks have shed a light on, we're spending so much of our time remotely. Our The lines between work and home have become more and more blurred, and so keeping those two separate has become increasingly harder. So I think instead of expecting that humans are going to behave in this very predictable way, it's really important to take into account that things are going to happen and people are going to use things differently. So in this case, it was a glitch, but it's also common. I don't know how often you all have seen it. I know in the last 2 years of using lots and lots of Zoom, I've seen it a ton where people have accidentally screen shared something that they didn't intend to screen share. Part of it's just because it's not super obvious, that like whether you should share just one window or just a tab, or how to silence notifications. Those things aren't really laid out clearly, and that's kind of a design problem. But the example here, I picked it especially because it seems super minor to me, in the sense that on the surface, it's like, okay, somebody accidentally screen shared their personal calendar during an interview. But if you kind of think about what consequences that could have, it suddenly becomes clear that it may not be that minor, because the person could have, there could have been something on the calendar that maybe was seemingly inappropriate that turned off the interviewer and cost this person the job. It could have been a situation where maybe all of the other interviews they had scheduled were shown on that calendar, and that could have been problematic. Or maybe they had listed where they were going to be on Saturday night, and if there was someone in the crowd that listening to this interview that wanted that information, they suddenly had it. So there's a lot of little things that can happen. And this New York Times article, I love the title, which was, how to not ruin your life or just die of embarrassment with a screen share, because it's such a common experience. And yet those fail safes haven't really been built in, where we're not really warned that, hey, something else could happen. One example, just from something that I observed recently, was we had someone accidentally at work end up sharing that she was pregnant. She wasn't intending to share it with us, because she got, a text from her husband, and it popped up on the screen because she didn't have notifications off, which again, arguably could be something she could have turned off. But also, we need to make sure our software is proactively accounting for situations like that and warning people of preventing those errors in the first place. And so she accidentally announced her pregnancy to everyone, and it wasn't something she wanted to share. So it can be really tricky. This example is another one of just if we're not accounting for differences between people, different use cases, things can go really badly. And this example just breaks my heart. It's a great sad example of algorithmic bias, but in it, this person's daughter was, trying to take an exam via proctor. There was a proctoring software she had to use, but because of her dark skin, she wasn't able to be recognized by that software, and so she ended up having to literally like put a flashlight above her head just to take the exam. Now, not only is that inconvenient, but it's outright dehumanizing to have to do that. It's humiliating. It could take a toll on your self-esteem. It could have very likely caused her to have, a worse grade because she wasted time on that, which could down the road lead to fewer opportunities. And it could just be a whole, a plethora of problems. Um, and it really brings to light this question of, we need to make sure, like, are our samples diverse enough? Are our data sets representative? And it's not something that we can just shrug off and go with the most common use case and expect everything to be okay. We really need to account for when people are different and when people use what we build in different ways. And then finally, the last category is just life happens, right? So what, like, as they say, like, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. Things don't always follow the happy path. We all have bad days. Sometimes we have bad years. And so we really need to make sure that we're proactively building for those kinds of things. So an example is this feature or features, I guess, that kind of are in the same vein of looking back at past memories, right? So on Facebook, on Google, even Apple, like, there's a lot of different ways that we can look back at our previous photos and memories and things like that. And generally speaking, these features are wonderful, right? They can bring a lot of value. They bring a lot of joy. Sometimes you can get something, you can see something where it's like, oh, I haven't talked to this friend in 3 years, and it could be an excuse to reach out to them. Sometimes you are reminded of like a reunion or a birthday, and it just kind of puts a smile on your face. So the intentions, again, obviously good. However, the reality always isn't. Um, and you don't really have to do anything wrong in order to sometimes get on the wrong side of this. So I'll give you guys a second to read these, but the gist is that these, Google Photos and Facebook um, rediscover, is in some ways reminding some people of really painful memories. So one person's talking about how they they just lost their little sister, and Facebook's reminding them of like, oh, when they friended their sister. And Google Photos is like, oh, hey, here's this memory from 3 years ago, when it could have been a breakup. It could have been the loss of a loved one. It could have been a lot of things that were really painful. So another reminder, intention is not equal to impact. And we need to think not just about the good and like what good a feature that we're really excited about could bring, but also what pain could it cause? How can we prevent embarrassment? How could we prevent danger? How could we prevent heartache? So the good news is, there are some like actions that have been taken since. Ideally, something like this would have been done before. Like now, Facebook memorializes when a friend passes away, and that way you don't get any reminders associated with all of these things. But that doesn't mean that a number of people should have had to go through that kind of emotional pain first. If it had occurred to someone that like, oh, what if something really bad happened to someone? How can we make sure they have a way to opt out, or that they're asked before we just push this new photo on them? Maybe we should make sure that they're in the right headspace for it. There's a lot of harm that we could have prevented. Here's another example, very similar, where Apple kind of automatically creates albums, and most of the time it's really helpful. I mean, I know for me it's been valuable in the past. So it's a very complex problem to solve. I'm not saying it's an easy, clear-cut solution, but in this situation, Apple was classifying photos that were associated with a painful memory for someone as celebratory. And so I think there's sometimes an inclination to make assumptions, and we have to do that, right, in our line of work, but sometimes we make assumptions and we take them too far, and we don't account for all of the different different situations in life that someone might be going through. And here's a quote that I'm going to read to you because I really loved it. And it's from one of the co authors of Design for Real Life, Eric Meyer. And he actually um, started writing about this, especially after losing his daughter. He lost his daughter and then was sort of bombarded with all sorts of just memories that were incredibly painful. And so I'm going to read this to you. And it says, this inadvertent algorithmic cruelty is the result of code that works in the overwhelming majority of cases, reminding people of the awesomeness of their years, showing them selfies at a party or whale spouts from sailing boats or the marina outside their vacation house. But for those of us who lived through the death of loved ones, or spent extended time in the hospital, or were hit with divorce or losing a job or any one of 100 crises, we might not want to look another look at this past year. And so, you know, it is all of us again go through these things, but oftentimes when we're in the mode of creating, we don't really remember that. And so it's really important to account for those differences and just how life goes. And so finally, I want to talk about okay, we've heard all these terrible examples of just ways that people have been hurt, but how can we use our privilege for good? What can we do to make a difference? We can't obviously prevent everything from going wrong. Some of these are very nuanced. But how can we make some baby steps? So, a couple of principles to keep in mind. One is that always think worst case scenario. So, try to think about what if everything doesn't go right? What if it actually goes terribly wrong? Is there a situation in which this exact feature or this exact message or whatever it is that I'm building, is there a situation in which this could get someone's day completely, take it off the rails? Um, and then also assess the stakes. There's some industries in which, or some spaces in which the stakes are far, far higher than others. For instance, anytime you're talking about, let's say, finances or someone's health, or even like traveling or getting from one place to another, or the government, like these can all have ripple effects that can really result in some negative consequences that are maybe not as minor as like, okay, if you can't use, let's say, if you can't post a picture on Instagram for a day, maybe you'll be okay. But if, let's say, you need to apply for a visa to go abroad, so that you can like attend a loved one's funeral or wedding or something like that, that has higher stakes. And if one thing doesn't work for someone, it can have a bunch of ripple effects. So it's really important to think about that. And then finally, consider other people's experiences. We are not the experts. We're the expert on our own lived experiences, and we're the expert on how to do our jobs. But ultimately, what we're building is usually for people outside of ourselves. And so it's so, so key that we don't just think about how we would use something, but we think about, okay, beyond our good intentions, what are some of the things that could go wrong? And then there's also some activities that we can do that kind of help that can help anchor us and give us a little bit of structure as we're trying to think about like what the different ways something could go wrong is. So I don't know how many of you watch Black Mirror, amazing show if you haven't seen it already, but there's this episode in Black Mirror called Hated in the Nation. And it's a brilliant exploration of like data security and robotics as well as hate speech online. But basically, in this episode, what happens is I'm going to try not to give too many spoilers, but there's a government agency that's developed these robotic bees to help replace the dying bee population. So all of a sudden, you can already tell they're right there. That right there is a good intention, right? They're trying to replace the dying bee population. However, these bees are hacked, right, by someone, a bad actor, who uses them to then kill people who are criticized online. And the fact that a bad actor like a hacker got that probably wasn't something that was ever accounted for, but all of a sudden the solution that was supposed to help has become this like terrifying threat. And so the idea behind Black Mirror brainstorming is you can do kind of a cross-functional workshop with your team, as in like have people from different functions there and try to and it can be a little bit fun. Try to create like a Black Mirror episode where it doesn't, you don't have to actually write everything out, but just try to think of if the plot of a Black Mirror episode had to revolve around your team's product, what are the ways in which it could be misused? What are the ways in which it could accidentally result in something really bad? What would the villain in this episode do, right? And a kind of a light version of that is it's very similar to like a pre-mortem where you just instead of a retro or post-mortem where you look back and say, okay, these are all the things that went well, these are all the things that went wrong, here's how we could do better. Instead, you're almost preemptively trying to figure out, okay, here's the project. Where are all the places that this could go wrong? And knowing that, what should we do differently? How should we prepare? How should we change course? All right. So hopefully that's an exercise that could come in handy. Another one is I'm sure many of you are familiar with these already, but usability and abusability testing can be so important. So for instance, the screen share example I shared, it's one that's not necessarily a mistake, but it's just people aren't warned enough about like even if there was a simple warning that just said like before someone's shared their entire screen that said like everything that pops on up on the screen will be visible, to your audience, that might give people pause and it might make them reconsider their options and their choices and they might select something different that's a little bit less likely to cause humiliation or harm. But that could have been revealed in usability testing, especially if the results were taken seriously and actually included in the plan going forward. But another thing that you can do is also abusability testing. And basically, the idea here is that instead of just thinking about well-meaning people and like personas where people are maybe different but trying to just do complete their tasks as intended. Instead, try to think about like bad actors. What if you had for every persona that you have or every like use case that you think about, try to include one that has somebody that's intending to do harm and try to think through like, okay, what is it that this person might try to do? And is there a way that we could get ahead of it or prevent it in the first place? Um, and also when, conducting research is a great way to learn more from other people's experiences. And when you do that kind of research or testing, it can be really valuable to have the ask the people that you're talking to tell you about a time that, if assuming it's something that's already built, especially to tell them they can tell you about a time where they've had a bad experience, not just in terms from a technical standpoint, but a bad emotional experience. Like, is there some time that they tried to use what you built or what some, colleague built and it caused some sort of distress or it had consequences that maybe you hadn't considered? That can also be a really good way to just think about what's happening next. And then also more diverse recruiting and testing. And when I say recruiting, I'm talking both about on your team, because of course, if you have a more, I think this topic is probably very, very familiar to all of you, but if you have a more diverse team, you're more likely to mitigate each other's blind spots. You're more likely to realize that like, oh, hey, something here could go wrong because based on this experience I've had in the past. You're more likely to be mindful of accessibility. And so recruiting for your team and making sure your teams themselves are diverse is super important. But then also the next step, recruiting in, making sure your data sets are representative and diverse, making sure that when you're doing testing, it's with diverse participants. It's not with everybody who looks and acts and thinks exactly the same. And so that can also help you kind of triangulate different perspectives. So now to kind of wrap up and give you some real like really practical questions that you can ask yourself as you're going through a project, even if you don't necessarily want to rethink the entire project. Just start to think about, who is going to use this? Who's going to use it? How are we choosing that? And on the flip side, who can't use this? And why is that? Or is this, are we intentionally excluding this group? Or it can be a good way to figure out whether you're just forgetting certain people. And then after that, ask about, what if it doesn't work for them? So it's really important not just to think about, okay, well, this is what we're building because we know these people want to complete this task, but what if they're not able to? And what is the worst case scenario? What could happen if they can't complete this task? And then finally, what are the consequences of that? Is this kind of a siloed experience, or would there be some follow-up issues? Is there like, can the pain compound, right? So if someone was trying to access something again related to their health, if they weren't able to get through a system, one of the examples that came up earlier in the pandemic, for me at least, was around, there was something where there was a form where people there was a minimum for a last name of it had to be at least 3 letters. So anybody with a last name of 2 or fewer letters couldn't go through and submit this form, and this form was for a COVID test. So you can imagine here, that creates a lot of problems because if this person thought they had COVID, wanted to sign up, weren't able to because, the form wasn't allowing them to go through because it hadn't been accounted for that, "Oh, maybe we should allow people with just 2-letter last names through." There's over 1,000,000 people, with last names that are 2 letters around the world. Um, that could then lead to follow-up effects, right? Because then that person might go to a party, other people might have gotten COVID, like, it could prevent them from getting care when they need it. It could prevent them from being able to go to work, and you see what I'm saying, there's just these compounding effects that can happen, and so when we prioritize speed to market above everything else, we basically do so at the expense of well-being, not just as individuals, but as a greater society, and that's just a really, really high price to pay. So just try to keep these questions in mind. And then there's the inevitable question of like, there's times where we can't slow down, right? There's times where we really don't have much of a choice and we just have to, for whatever reason, whether it's a mandate from, a boss or whether it's a situation where not moving fast would actually be more problematic than just putting something out there. In those situations, make sure that you're owning it. Own that it's not ideal, acknowledge the consequences. Just make sure that you and your team are aware of what those consequences are, what the potential fallout is, what those stakes are, and then manage people's expectations. So communicate to them what they can or cannot expect. Don't waste their time. So an example is that if, let's say, at this conference, we're really lucky that we have live captioning. But if, let's say, that wasn't available, it'd be really important to make sure that that was known to people so that if someone was planning to attend and really needed the captions, they wouldn't have like cleared their schedule to attend only to find out that they weren't going to be accommodated. So just communicating clearly in advance with people about, what's not there it can be really valuable. And then finally, revisit your solution. We call it an MVP for a reason. So let's not make an MVP the final result. Iterate when you do have more time. And sometimes it can really help to just put something on the calendar for the future and say, all right, we're going to come back to this when we're not in this fire drill time crunch mode. And as the Hall of Fame basketball player and coach John Wooden has said in the past, if you don't have time to do it right, when will you have time to do it over? It's a really good reminder that rushing through something might save you time right now, but it might, ultimately it's going to take you more time in the future, especially if there's problems. Everyone's going to be in a new fire drill mode. So sometimes saving time is great, but not when it comes at a cost. And finally, this is a saying my 5th grade teacher used to tell us all the time because he didn't like to have to correct our work, and it stuck with me over the years. Be lazy, do it right the first time. Let's slow down and heal things. Let's not wait until something has gone off the rails and caused harm. Let's try to be the voice in the room that brings these things up proactively. It'll help, us sleep at night, feel better. It'll help our customers in the long run, and it'll just pave the way for a better society. Thank you so much for the gift of your attention and your time. And please feel free to reach out to me. I'm on Twitter way more than I should be. And you can also find me on LinkedIn if you prefer.